Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into the profound and, well, often complex history of American civil rights. And we're looking at it through a truly unique lens, maybe even a controversial one. Our guide for this journey is Sean Armstrong. He's a distinguished self-defense author, but his writing, it really spans history, politics, philosophy. He even has a noted admiration for C.S. Lewis.
That's right. And Armstrong's background, it's quite diverse. He holds degrees in criminal justice and homeland security.
Mm-hmm.
But what really seems to enrich his narratives, giving them a robust framework for understanding human behavior in, well, tumultuous times, is a lifetime of travel and actual real-world experience.
Right. And you can really see that breadth in his publications. He's written Tactical Training with Firearms. That's a practical self-defense guide. But then also Bloodstained Banner, which gets into the historical failures of socialism and communism and World War II. From Pearl Harbor to Rio de Janeiro, plus my essays on C.S. Lewis, sort of blending personal insights with scholarly analysis. But for this deep dive, we're focusing on his provocative book, The History of American Civil Rights and the Laos Hijacking of the Noble Fight for Civil Rights.
And it's probably worth noting here, this book is apparently so controversial, it's actually been blocked on Amazon Kindle, though you can still find it on Google Books and Google Play, I believe.
Yep. Which honestly just makes me even more curious. So our mission today is to sort of extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from Armstrong's historical analysis and the foundational documents he references. We want to help you, our listener, understand the evolution of civil rights, the different philosophies within the movement, and the contemporary debates around it all. Think of it as your shortcut to being truly well-informed on this pivotal American narrative, maybe with some surprising facts thrown in. So to really understand this journey, we kind of have to start at the very beginning, with the founding principles of the nation itself. The roots of civil rights in America, they're often traced back to Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who championed what they called natural rights.
Right, that's the belief in inherent freedoms for individuals, just because you're human. And these powerful ideas, well, they provided a philosophical bedrock, you could say. They profoundly influenced the early abolitionist movements. During the antebellum period, you had figures like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, key advocates for emancipation. And their arguments were grounded in that moral imperative that slavery was a clear violation of these natural rights.
They weren't just thinkers, they were doers, right?
Yeah.
They actively organized societies, promoted anti-slavery literature, and of course, famously operated the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved people escape to freedom. Their efforts were this collective push for civil rights, really driven by a deep sense of moral righteousness. But here's where it gets really interesting and paradoxical. The stark contradiction at America's founding.
Exactly. The Declaration of Independence proclaiming all men are created equal. Majestic words. Yet the institution of slavery persisted. Thomas Jefferson, who actually penned those words, owned over 600 enslaved people during his life. His writings, like Notes on the State of Virginia, they kind of reveal his internal conflict. He acknowledged slavery's moral shortcomings, called its influence unhappy, destructive to morals, and amor patriae. That's a love of country. He even expressed sort of trepidation about divine justice. But at the same time, he defended it as an economic necessity for the agrarian states.
It just makes you wonder, doesn't it, how a nation could reconcile something so fundamentally dehumanizing right at its core. Jefferson's struggle, it seems to reflect a broader tension among the founders. Benjamin Franklin, for example. He initially owned slaves, but evolved into a pretty ardent abolition advocate. He even co-founded the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery. So that shows an evolving awareness, maybe. But like you said, the economic and political aspects of slavery were just so deeply embedded that you got compromises like the Three-Fifths Compromise during the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how deeply embedded those economic and political aspects were. It led directly to those kinds of compromises. Enslaved individuals were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation,
Right.
but crucially denied any rights themselves.
And this necessary evil justification for slavery, how was that used?
Well, it was primarily used to maintain economic stability, especially in the South, the agrarian economy, and also to preserve regional identity. It got reinforced by pseudoscientific theories, even religious justifications sometimes. Later on, figures like John C. Calhoun would go even further, calling slavery a positive good, arguing it actually benefited society somehow.
Wow. Yet, even amidst all that, there were some early federal attempts to limit slavery's expansion, weren't there?
Yes, absolutely. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, for instance, it prohibited slavery in new territories north and west of the Ohio River. So that signaled an evolving, maybe slow, but evolving ideological stance within the federal government itself.
Okay, so the Civil War finally ends slavery. But as you said, that was just the beginning of the fight for actual equality. This brings us into the Reconstruction era, a really critical period for trying to establish legal equality.
Indeed. After the Civil War, you had three pivotal Reconstruction amendments ratified. The 13th Amendment in 1865 that formally abolished slavery, done. Then the 14th Amendment in 1868. This guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law for everyone born or naturalized in the U.S. I mean, that was revolutionary. And finally, the 15th Amendment in 1870 secured voting rights for African-American men, saying you couldn't deny the vote based on race or previous servitude.
Seems like huge steps forward on paper.
Huge. But what's striking here isn't just the ambition of these amendments, it's how quickly those legal gains were mined. It really reveals that law alone, it's rarely enough to dismantle systems that are deeply entrenched in society.
And that undermining started almost immediately, right? Which leads us to the first Civil Rights Act of 1866.
Exactly. That act was a direct response to the Black Codes. These were discriminatory state laws popping up in the South, designed specifically to restrict the freedoms of newly freed African Americans. Things like enforcing labor contracts, restricting movement, basically trying to perpetuate a new kind of servitude.
So what did the 1866 Act do to counter that?
Well, it was pretty bold for its time. It formally defined all persons born in the U.S. except untaxed Native Americans as citizens. It granted them equal protection under the law and really vital rights like property ownership, making contracts, testifying in court. Its significance was immense. It represented an unprecedented assertion of federal authority over state laws when it came to civil rights. It even provided for punitive measures against violators. It had teeth, at least in theory.
So what did this all mean, practically speaking, for the newly freed individuals trying to exercise these rights? Was it effective?
Well, that's the thing. Despite being a legal triumph, the reality on the ground, it was much, much harder. The act's effectiveness was severely hampered by just systemic resistance from southern states. Enforcement was inconsistent, to say the least. And you saw the violent emergence of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan actively terrorizing people.
So the federal will to enforce it just wasn't strong enough.
Ultimately, yeah. Federal commitment to Reconstruction really started to wane by the late 1870s. There were economic pressures, the Panic of 1873 didn't help, and political compromises were made. And this, unfortunately, set the stage for the Jim Crow era, laws that systematically institutionalized segregation and disenfranchisement. Things like literacy tests, poll taxes, all sorts of barriers designed to stop black men from voting.
And as we move into the late 19th century, the Supreme Court itself gets involved. And not necessarily in a helpful way for civil rights.
That's a crucial point, yeah. The Supreme Court played a significant and often, frankly, detrimental role. They significantly narrowed the scope of those Reconstruction amendments through judicial interpretation, basically watering them down. Take the slaughterhouse cases in 1873. Justice Samuel Miller's ruling limited the 14th Amendment's reach. He essentially asserted that states still held significant power over their citizens' rights, despite the federal protections. Kind of created two tiers of citizenship rights.
Okay, so limiting the federal government's power to protect citizens from their own states?
Precisely. And then, United States v. Cruikshank in 1876 went even further. It limited the federal government's power to prosecute individuals for civil rights violations. This effectively reduced protections against private discrimination, which was, rampant.
And this judicial erosion, it culminates in that infamous case, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
Ah, yes. Plessy, Homer Plessy, a man classified as black under Louisiana law, deliberately challenged segregation. He sat in a whites-only railroad car, got arrested, and the case went all the way up.
And the ruling?
The Supreme Court upheld the doctrine of separate but equal. They asserted that, and this is a quote, "The enforced separation of races does not stamp the colored race with a badge of inferiority." This ruling, it legitimized racial segregation across the board. It gave judicial endorsement to Jim Crow laws. These laws systematically perpetuated inequality by consistently providing inferior facilities for African Americans. It was always separate, but never really equal in practice.
But there was one voice of dissent on the court in that case, wasn't there? Justice Harlan.
Yes. Justice John Marshall Harlan. His dissenting opinion was incredibly powerful and prophetic, really. He argued that our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. He insisted that segregation was inherently discriminatory, that it institutionalized prejudice.
So his view was completely ignored at the time.
Largely, yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, though, Harlan's vision, even though it was dismissed for decades, it's a powerful testament. It shows how minority opinions, even unpopular ones, can lay the philosophical groundwork for huge shifts later on. His dissent provided a crucial foundation, a sort of intellectual touchstone for future civil rights advocates and the legal battles against discrimination, especially in the mid-20th century.
That's a fascinating insight. It really highlights how these legal ideas can sort of simmer for decades before their time truly comes. Which brings us to the evolving strategies within the civil rights movement itself. Because there wasn't always agreement on the best path forward for Black advancement, was there?
No, not at all. You had some really distinct philosophical approaches emerging. Booker T. Washington, for instance, emphasized vocational skills, economic self-sufficiency, practical training. His focus was really on building a strong economic base from the ground up. He believed that economic power would eventually lead to social and political equality. Get the economic foundation first.
Okay, focus on practical skills, jobs, economic independence. How did that contrast with, say, W.E.B. Du Bois?
Well, Du Bois had a very different vision. He talked about the talented tenth.
Hmm.
He advocated for higher education, liberal arts, cultivating an intellectual leadership class among African Americans. The idea was that this educated elite, the talented tenth, would then uplift the broader community. He famously argued, a university is a human invention for the transmission of knowledge and culture. No other human invention will suffice, not even trade and industrial schools.
So it's a fundamental debate, isn't it? About the path to progress. Is it economic advancement first or intellectual and political leadership?
Absolutely. And these strategic differences, they extended beyond just education. They went into the very tactics of the movement itself. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, famously championed nonviolent resistance. You see this powerfully articulated in his letter from a Birmingham City jail. He drew a very clear distinction.
Between just and unjust laws, right?
Exactly. Just laws, he said, uplift human personality. They're rooted in moral or natural law. Unjust laws, on the other hand, degrade human personality. They're out of harmony with moral law. Or maybe they're inflicted by a majority on minority without the minority's consent.
And his justification for civil disobedience, for breaking those unjust laws.
It was profound. He argued for breaking them openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. The goal wasn't anarchy. It was to arouse the conscience of the community, make people see the injustice. He cited historical examples, Socrates, early Christians, even actions against Hitler's Germany. He also expressed this powerful impatience with the advice to wait. He famously stated, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied," really conveying the deep, deep frustrations under segregation.
And he even embraced being called an extremist.
He did. He embraced the idea of being a creative extremist. He cited figures like Jesus, the prophet Amos, Paul, Martin Luther, even Abraham Lincoln, noting Lincoln believed this nation cannot survive half slave and half free, and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "All men are created equal." For King, the question wasn't if they would be extremists for justice, but rather, what kind of extremists will we be? One for hate or one for love and justice?
Which stands in pretty stark contrast to another pivotal approach within the movement around that time, Malcolm X and his advocacy for Black separatism and self-determination.
Right. A very different philosophy and strategy there. And this really raises an important question, doesn't it? How do these differing philosophies, both educationally with Washington versus Du Bois and strategically with King versus Malcolm X, how do they reflect these broader debates about integration versus autonomy? And what are their lasting legacies today? I mean, these are questions that still echo in contemporary discussions about community building, political strategy, the very meaning of progress.
Okay, so moving into the mid-20th century, we then see these major legislative victories, the culmination, in many ways, of decades of struggle.
Yes, the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Huge. And the Voting Rights Act in 1965 aimed at finally eliminating those barriers to voting, like literacy tests. Affirmative action also emerged around this time as a sort of tool intended to expand equality and address systemic discrimination head-on.
Now, this is where Sean Armstrong's book, the one we mentioned earlier, really starts to analyze contemporary politics through the lens of this history.
Right. His book, The History of American Civil Rights and the Less Hijacking of the Noble Fight. It delves into how he sees contemporary identity politics operating, particularly within the framework of that 1964 Civil Rights Act. He analyzes what he perceives as its moral frameworks and agendas today.
Okay, and he introduces some specific concepts. One he calls the victims of a democratic playing card deck. What do you mean by that? How does Armstrong define that strategy?
Well, from Armstrong's perspective, and we should stress this is his analysis we're relaying here, the argument is that specific demographic groups, defined by race, age, gender, class, are portrayed as wronged or disadvantaged.
Hmm.
Obvious. The book then contends that these groups are utilized as essential voting blocks by the Democratic Party. And part of this strategy, as he describes it, involves framing opposing parties like Republicans and conservatives as adversaries. The narrative, according to the book, uses fear-mongering to solidify loyalty. Things like suggesting Republicans are holding them down or destroying Social Security, or that women's rights are constantly under siege.
So the core idea there, from his view, is about leveraging perceived grievances for political gain. Okay. He also describes something he calls the populist bomb. What's that about?
The populist bomb, in Armstrong's analysis, is described as a strategy. It involves articulating messages that resonate deeply with people's desires and fears. It often incorporates race and class grievances, attacks Republicans, and makes attractive proposals like, say, universal health care, without raising taxes, which Armstrong claims might lack real substantiation. The aim, according to the book, is to draw individuals into what he calls the victims of the Democratic playing card deck, by essentially telling them what they want to hear.
Right. It sounds like he's detailing how he sees certain political messaging being crafted and deployed. And then there's this metaphor, the modern Democrat plantation. It's quite provocative. It's been used by others, too, like Dinesh D'Souza. Charles Barkley mentioned it. Can you walk us through what that metaphor implies, according to Armstrong?
Yeah, it's definitely a strong metaphor. It draws parallels between the historical plantation system characterized by dependency, limited opportunities, and the socioeconomic conditions he observes in certain urban environments today. The suggestion, as Armstrong presents it, is that there's a political class that promises support, but, in his view, ultimately stifles growth and self-sufficiency among these populations. He gives the example of resistance to initiatives like gentrification. He argues this resistance might serve to disrupt the status quo, preventing economic uplift that could maybe lead to a shift in voting patterns, thus maintaining what he calls a dependent electorate.
Okay. It's certainly a critical and, as you said, provocative take on modern politics. Now, in stark contrast to these critiques, we also looked at the Black feminist perspectives, specifically from the Combahee River Collective Statement. This offers a very different and crucial intersectional view.
Indeed, very different lens. This statement, which came out in 1977, it explains its origins in Black women's continuous life and death struggle for survival and liberation, unquote. They trace this back to their extremely negative relationship to the American political system, precisely because they belong to, as they put it, two oppressed racial and sexual castes.
So digging into that statement, it really highlights their focus on this simultaneous experience of oppression, doesn't it? Racial, class, and sex oppression all at once. They give the explicit example of racial sexual oppression, like the historical use of rape of Black women by white men as a political weapon, and they explicitly reject being put on pedestals or treated as queens. They just desire recognition as human, levelly human. It really speaks to that unique position they describe, battling on multiple fronts simultaneously.
Absolutely. And they talk about their approach to solidarity. It involves struggling with progressive Black men against racism, while also struggling with Black men about sexism, a complex dynamic. Notably, they reject lesbian separatism. They also reject biological determinism as a dangerous and reactionary basis for building politics. They really emphasize the profound psychological toll of being a Black woman in America and the immense challenge of fighting oppression on all these fronts, often without privilege or resources. Their belief instead is in collective process and a non-hierarchical distribution of power within their movements.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. This section really illustrates the multifaceted and, yes, sometimes conflicting interpretations of civil rights and justice that exist in contemporary discourse. It showcases such a wide range of perspectives on identity, power, social change. What these differing contemporary analyses, from Armstrong's critiques to the Combahee River Collective Statement, what they truly illuminate is the ongoing, often contentious debate. It's not just about what civil rights means today, but who gets to define it and how power dynamics are perceived and challenged across the entire political spectrum. It's definitely a reminder that these conversations are rarely simple or monolithic. So, what does this all mean for us? As we bring this deep dive to a close, it seems pretty clear that the history of American civil rights isn't some neat, linear progression from A to B, from one victory to the next. It's really a complex, ongoing struggle, marked by triumphs, yes, but also setbacks and these constantly evolving interpretations of its core principles.
And that's precisely why it's so important, I think, to critically examine these historical narratives and the contemporary movements that invoke them. We have to recognize how foundational principles, even those nobly established, can be reinterpreted, maybe even co-opted over time by various ideological factions. Understanding these shifts, these reinterpretations, is really key to grasping the ongoing discourse around civil rights today.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. Given this rich, often contentious history of American civil rights and this constant reevaluation of its core principles, how do we, as informed citizens, navigate all these competing narratives? How do we ensure that the noble pursuit of liberty and justice for all remains, well, untainted by ideological opportunism and stays true to its origins in a society that's clearly still grappling with some very complex inequalities?